So there is a huge concern in the United States about high inflation and high cost of living, and now an additional concern about high interest rates. However, as we're told, interest rates are a necessary tool to control credit, slowing down the economy and thus bringing inflation down. But is it really how it works? So that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. So, first off, we need to go to the concept we learned. So, high interest rates are considered to be tightening because they slow down credit. And that would create kind of a counterbalance as a lever that Jerome Powell and the Fed can use to control interest rates. And when you do the opposite, it should actually be stimulating because low interest rates mean that we have cheap credit, which also would mean abundant credit. But it is actually the opposite when you understand what happened to the economy after 2008. But that myth actually still lives on and pretty vividly in the media, especially when we talk about the Fed funds rate. So if you see here, it shows pretty well how interest rates were used as a tool by 2020, for example. Then you see, of course, everybody remembers the pandemic. There was a huge cut to zero, and then 2 years later, then you had the reopening and many inflation scares that were basically a supply shock worldwide. Of course, everybody was trapped home, and we have a huge chaos on the global supply chain. And that's where the Fed came in with something that took everybody by surprise. It was the fastest interest rate raise and the most intense in the Fed's history. So it went from 5%. And now we had until 2024, everybody was discussing about should we cut? Should we? When is the Fed pivot? Right? Everybody was actually waiting for the Fed to pivot. To make sure that we re-stimulate the economy and do not bring the U.S. into recession. And right now we are in a kind of a limbo because they did pivot, but they stopped. And now they're paralyzed. They don't know what to do. What should we do? Because if we raise rates, we may break the economy, but if we cut rates, that might bring inflation back because inflation is still sticky, over 2%. There's a whole lot going on in what comes to narratives, and this is because the fundamentals don't work like that. If you really want to understand what happens on the side of the Fed, for example, so this is how the Fed imagines, and this is also due to a lot of Alan Greenspan and the whole situation that we learn, like central banking 101, is that we control the economy by the Fed funds rate. So that would be a basic interest rate, a target interest rate that everything else should follow because of that, right? So we have on the left the Fed target, and then we have the rest of the curve, which is the time frames for maturity, the 3 month yield, 6 month, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, and so forth. And the idea, at least behind central banking thinking, is that once we set the Fed target rate, everything else is just going to follow magically through a formula that would be exact, and the market would readjust itself towards that formula. But of course, it's not really what happens. So you see many times where a normal curve would look like the blue one, where we call that forward guidance. That's something that is it's almost a consensus, right? Everybody waits for the Fed to do something, and then the market would react to it. But it's actually the opposite. The Fed is actually the institution that reacts to what the yield curve has already done. Why is that? Because you also have the idea of an inverted yield curve that you see here in red, and that actually happened in 2023. The yield curve has been inverted for a while. It uninverts a few times, it inverts again, and this means that longer time to maturities or longer term yields can be lower than short term, which wouldn't make any sense if you don't think them as collateral, that I explained on my last video as well. But it shows that this perpetuates, right? Everybody's waiting for the FOMC meeting, and are they going to cut or are they not going to cut? And that creates a whole lot of confusion. And of course, it's more complicated than we think. And this is why, and this is very complicated to explain on a simple video like that in a few minutes. But we're going to dive deeper and deeper into the monetary mechanics, which affects liquidity, which affects the Bitcoin price, in our latest Bitcoin intelligence report that you can see on the link below in the description. Just make sure you use the promo code below as well for 5% off. Okay, so back to our situation here. So what actually changed from 2008? So we did have a huge change in how central banking monetary policy stopped working due to the fact that it was completely flushed with bank reserves. So when the whole banking problem worldwide happened after 2008, and it was a monetary phenomenon, not even a financial one, they needed bailouts. And though that excess liquidity that had to be generated to bail out the system actually neutralized completely the ability for the Fed to control those rates in the first place. And now, and on top of that, that creates a whole regime of deficits. Those deficits, and I discussed about that as well in our latest video, created a whole different dynamic. So the problem now, let's say about raising rates, right? So what happens is we have so much of a fiscal spending that the problem now is that when you have a country like the United States with over 100% of GDP in federal debt, which happened basically in recent years, when you raise interest rates, they ironically increase the federal deficit at a faster pace that they would slow down private sector credit growth. So basically the idea is, of course, you're going to consume less. Maybe you're not going to purchase that house. We have that happening in the United States right now, with mortgage rates being so high. But at the same time, you create more expenses on interest rates, on fiscal, just to pay for the interest rate expenses, which creates a huge problem. And that money is flushed into the economy as well. So they get completely neutralized. But there is another event that's actually pretty interesting when you think about the opposite. Okay, so let's say that actually the economy in the United States is going to a recession. We should cut rates, right? There is a lot of pressure from Trump into Jerome Powell. You should cut rates as soon as possible. We controlled inflation. There is no inflation. And you should start doing that cut as soon as possible. So when you cut Fed funds rate, the opposite, actually a pretty interesting effect happens. So you expect for credit to be plentiful because it's pretty cheap. Let's say we cut that back to zero. Let's say we go back to this part here, right? Like 2020. Let's stimulate the economy again. The problem is, you see that first off, it's a movement that starts in the longer end of the curve and not even a Fed funds rate. So because the Fed follows what happens and not the other way around. But you also see that most of that movement of low interest rates happen when you have entities buying bonds, which is a safe haven. So it's a flight to safety. Interest rates go down, and by them going down, despite the credit being cheaper, it's exactly the time they're not plentiful. Because if you need credit in the real economy, you want a new credit card, maybe you want to buy a new home, maybe you want to do something for your company, you want to invest in your expending or hiring people, those low interest rates do not mean that you're going to be able to get the credit, even though it's so. In a low interest rate regime, what you're going to see is that low rates mean tight money. That means banks are going for safety and liquidity, and when you go for safety and liquidity, you're not lending to anyone else because you're afraid that you might not be paid back. And this is exactly this creates an irony into that dynamic in interest rates. But also because interest rates get lower on the whole curve, uh, they actually create a less interest expense for the government, which creates less stimulation through fiscal spending. See a little bit how that works. So this creates a whole different effect than we expect. So right now that's why the Fed has this kind of confusion, and that's why the Fed is actually stuck here, because they're afraid of inflation, and you might want to raise interest rates, or at least you think you might. And if they do that, they might create a stimulating effect if they do it. So this is a pretty interesting scenario. But because the whole long end of the curve does not depend on the Fed, because forward guidance doesn't really work that way, the Fed is just stuck because they see all interest rates going up, and they say, look, I cannot cut, I cannot do anything. If I raise, I may be crushing the economy. So it creates a whole confusion, and nobody really understanding what's going on. It's that monetary policy. Of course, the Fed is never going to admit anything like that. If you have a whole careers depending on that ability, but the Fed actually does not provide any kind of monetary control. You can control, however, a lot of expectations. So this is why when you have a meeting like the Fed, the FOMC, everybody stops to watch and see what the media asks. It's all about the projection of expectations on what the Fed would like for the economy to do, and influence their behavior in doing so. So if you create that expectation that people are going to act the way that you intend them to act, this is where the true power for monetary policy actually lies. So it's literally 98% discourse and 2% monetary mechanics. So this is why we have so many smoke screens, and of course it creates some it requires some time for you to grasp that idea, because it's the complete opposite that we see in the media, but that drives liquidity. So what should I learn about that? Because sometimes you think that we are in a tightening scenario, and right now the Fed is quote unquote tightening, which does not have any effect in the US. It has more effects though in the euro dollar system outside of the United States, but not really in the US when you have so much liquidity being infused in the United States economy through fiscal deficits. So hope that gives you a little bit of an idea why we have so much confusion on the discourse. And I want at every video, I want to give you new tools so that you can create your own strategies, your own idea. But for sure, again, our Bitcoin intelligence report that just released yesterday is going to help a lot. It's very complete, and you can follow that with us in detail, understanding how the monetary mechanics work, and also on-chain analysis and the best macro analysis as well from Cena along with Wizard. Okay. All right. You guys have a wonderful day, and see you in the next video.